In every town, there's always someone everyone trusts without a second thought, a figure of authority, a pillar in the community, someone you believe will always do the right thing. But what happens when that trust is shattered? When the line between protector and predator blurs beyond recognition? In this quiet, familiar town, everything seemed blissfully normal. Children played in the streets, neighbors exchanged cheerful waves, and life moved along in its usual, unhurried way. Yet beneath the surface of this serene routine, something dark was brewing, something that would soon shake the town to its core. What do you do when the person everyone respects, the one sworn to serve and protect, has something to hide? At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary. He was the sheriff, a father, a husband. She was a bright young girl, full of potential and dreams. Their lives intersected as so many others did in this small town, but somewhere along the way, something shifted. Conversations that once felt casual stretched longer, innocent interactions turned into something far more complex. Before anyone could recognize the danger, a line had been crossed, a line that could never be uncrossed. How does a community confront the horrifying reality that the person they trusted most might be capable of the unimaginable? They say every crime leaves a trail, no matter how carefully it's hidden. But what happens when the one leading the investigation is the very person who knows precisely where that trail ends? Sheriff Clayton Marshall was more than a man in uniform. He was the bedrock of the town, a figure neighbors relied upon, colleagues respected, and his family adored. To most, Clayton epitomized the balance between the pressures of law enforcement and the responsibilities of being a husband and father. Married to Sharon, with 2 daughters, he seemed to embody the life others aspired to, skillfully balancing his career with his family's needs. His youngest daughter, Ella, idolized him. To her, he wasn't just the sheriff, he was her hero, the unwavering rock of their family. Ella's best friend, Monique Ellis, was practically family. She'd spent so much of her childhood in the Marshall household that she hardly needed to knock before walking in. Monique and Ella had been inseparable for as long as anyone could remember, from backyard games as toddlers to late-night study sessions in high school. Wherever Ella was, Monique wasn't far behind. But Monique wasn't just Ella's friend, she was the daughter of Officer Jerome Ellis, Clayton's close friend and longtime deputy. Jerome and Clayton shared more than just a professional bond, they were like brothers. They'd celebrated holidays together, shared family gatherings, and stood by each other through every twist and turn life had thrown at them. To Clayton, Monique's presence was as natural and constant as the ticking of a clock, a comforting background rhythm to his life. He remembered the day she was born as if it were yesterday, how he'd held her tiny, fragile body in his arms and promised Jerome he'd always be there for her. Their lives had woven together seamlessly over the years. There were neighborhood barbecues where Monique perched on Clayton's shoulders, family vacations where the Marshalls and the Elises laughed together, and Christmas mornings filled with gift exchanges. Monique was there for every birthday, recital, and lazy summer day, her presence intertwined with their lives like an unbreakable thread of shared memories. Sunday afternoons in the Marshall living room were a familiar comfort for Monique. Her connection to Clayton ran deep, unquestioned. To Monique, he wasn't just Ella's father, he was a steady, reliable figure in her life, a second father, someone she could trust implicitly. She'd never thought twice about being in his presence, whether it was at his home, at family gatherings, or even just passing by his office after school. But now Monique was 17, no longer the little girl Clayton had once lifted onto his shoulders. She was stepping into adulthood, determined to make something of herself. She had dreams of one day wearing a badge, of joining the ranks of top security agencies, maybe even the FBI or Secret Service. Her ambitions were powerful, filling any room she entered with her focused energy. Their lives, once linked through family and friendship, now hovered on the brink of a shift neither could see coming. Clayton noticed her more often these days, not just as Ella's best friend but as someone with her own presence, her own purpose. She was in his home almost every weekend, always around at family events, school functions, or occasionally stopping by the sheriff's office to meet her father, Jerome. Her presence had become a constant in the backdrop of his life, and with each passing day, their paths seemed to intertwine just a little more. It started like any other day, one that should have blended seamlessly into the rhythm of their routines. But some moments change everything, often in ways we least expect. Monique hadn't planned to stay long at the sheriff's station that afternoon. She'd only dropped by to see her father, Officer Jerome Ellis, hoping for a quick hello and a ride home. It was something she'd done countless times, waiting in the familiar hallways, surrounded by the low hum of conversations and the sporadic ringing of phones. It was ordinary, routine. But on this particular day, the air felt charged, subtly altered. Clayton noticed her from his office window as she entered the station, her presence drawing his attention in a way it never had before. She wasn't the same girl he remembered. The traces of adolescence had given way to the grace and quiet confidence of a young woman. He told himself it was nothing more than a passing observation, yet the thought lingered, unsettling him. He knew Monique well, too well, in fact. He'd laughed at her childhood antics, celebrated her achievements beside his daughter Ella. But today, something shifted, a recognition he couldn't fully explain. He tried to shake it off, reminding himself who she was, who he was, but the more he watched her, the harder it became to look away. She wasn't just Monique, the little girl at backyard birthday parties. She was someone else now, someone he found himself noticing in a way that made him uncomfortable. A sense of guilt nipped at the edges of his thoughts, whispering that this was wrong, that he had to stop. But temptation has a way of creeping in, seeping through the smallest cracks in even the strongest resolve. As much as he tried to push it away, it clung to him, persistent and unwelcome. When Monique made her way down the hall toward her father's desk, Clayton stepped out of his office almost instinctively. He knew Jerome was out on assignment, he'd sent him out earlier himself. There was no one else for Monique to meet, no one else to sit with. In that moment, Clayton saw an opportunity, a chance to extend this encounter, to satisfy a curiosity he didn't want to admit he felt. "Monique," he called out, his tone casual, almost fatherly. "Your dad's not back yet. Why don't you come wait in my office?" There was nothing in his voice to suggest anything more than friendly concern. Nothing seemed unusual, no reason for Monique to feel uneasy. She smiled with the easy confidence of someone who trusted without question. After all, this was her father's closest friend, a figure she'd known her entire life. She followed him without a second thought, walking into an office she'd seen countless times before. Clayton gestured for her to sit by the window, watching as she settled in comfortably. Her gaze wandered over the room, catching on the artifacts and framed photographs adorning the shelves, mementos from his years in law enforcement, commendations, keepsakes from old cases. The office, much like the man himself, was steeped in authority and the weight of experience. Monique admired it all, her eyes filled with wonder, unaware of the storm brewing in Clayton's mind. He tried to act naturally, to remind himself that this was just another conversation, just another day. But as he sat across from her, something inside him stirred, refusing to quiet down. She wasn't merely a visitor in his office, she was a young woman within arm's reach, someone who, for the first time in years, made him feel something unsettling and unexpected. He asked her about school, steering the conversation into familiar territory, and Monique, comfortable as ever, responded eagerly. She spoke about her classes, her friends, and the future she envisioned for herself. "I've been thinking about going into law enforcement," she said, her voice bright with enthusiasm. "Maybe as a detective, or even the Secret Service, something that really matters." Clayton listened closely, fully engaged. There was an earnest passion in her words, a spark of ambition that reminded him of his own youth. In that moment, an idea formed, a chance to extend this conversation, to position himself as her mentor, to create opportunities for future meetings. "You know," Clayton said slowly, "I have some connections in those agencies. I could put in a good word for you, maybe even arrange some hands-on experience." Monique's face lit up with excitement. "Really? You do that for me?" she asked, her gratitude genuine. He smiled, playing the role of the supportive mentor she believed him to be. Of course. But it's not an easy path, he said, voice tempered with wisdom. There's a lot to learn, and it'll take hard work. If you want, I could help you prepare. There was nothing in his tone that hinted at anything but genuine kindness, and Monique, eager to succeed, accepted the offer without a hint of hesitation. She didn't question his motives, why would she? To her, this was simply an experienced man offering guidance, someone she trusted implicitly. Clayton leaned back, satisfied with how smoothly the conversation had unfolded, how naturally he had laid the groundwork for future encounters. He told himself it was harmless, that he was merely helping a young woman with her goals. But deep down, he knew better. He knew that every word, every promise, was part of something far more complicated. As Monique sat across from him, her eyes bright with the promise of opportunities ahead, Clayton allowed himself a fleeting moment of satisfaction. He reveled in the power he held, the power to shape her dreams, to guide her path. And, if he chose, to take these meetings further than she could ever anticipate. In that instant, a line was crossed, a path of no return set in motion, one that could never be undone. Opportunities can feel like lifelines, especially when offered by someone you trust. For Monique, Clayton's mentorship felt like a precious step toward everything she'd dreamed of, a rare chance to get ahead in a fiercely competitive field, guided by someone with deep experience and insight. Influence and connections, these were powerful assets, but what Monique couldn't see, what no one saw, was how easily a dream could morph into a trap when placed in the wrong hands. Clayton's proposal seemed straightforward, a few private sessions, just the two of them, dedicated to preparing Monique for the demanding world of national security. He framed it as career mentorship, a chance to give her the competitive edge she needed to thrive. At first, Monique felt only gratitude. After all, how many young women her age were offered this kind of focused attention from someone so established? Clayton assured her that his guidance would set her apart, unlocking doors she hadn't even imagined. But Clayton was careful, too careful. Every word, every subtle suggestion was calculated. He began planting small seeds of doubt in Monique's mind. He cautioned her against telling too many people about their sessions, warning that others wouldn't understand her ambition. People might try to hold you back, he'd say. They'll tell you it's impossible, that you're reaching too high. The fewer people know, the better, it's safer that way. Initially, it made sense to Monique. She'd heard similar doubts from others, whispers that young women, especially women like her, shouldn't aim too high. Clayton's warnings felt protective, even wise. She didn't question them, why would she? He was only looking out for her, or so she believed. The sessions began innocently enough, discussions on the challenges of law enforcement, the resilience required to endure, and the skills she'd need to excel in high-pressure environments. They met after school hours at first, in Clayton's office, but soon they shifted to more private locations under the guise of focus training. He always made her feel exceptional, as though she was receiving something exclusive, something that set her apart. Eager to impress, Monique threw herself into the sessions, convinced they were the stepping stones to her future. Gradually, though, the tone of their meetings began to shift. What had started as professional mentorship slowly evolved into something more personal, more intimate. Clayton began asking about her life outside of school, her fears, her hopes, her relationships. The boundary between mentor and confidant blurred as he embedded himself deeper into her world, weaving himself into her life so subtly that she never noticed. He was patient, calculated, never rushing. He allowed Monique to come to him, to confide in him, tightening his grip on her life with each new layer of trust she placed in him. Captivated by his attention, Monique couldn't see it for what it was. She believed she was being guided, not manipulated. She thought Clayton was helping her, not grooming her. The sessions started to stretch later into the evening. Clayton always had a reason for extending them, an important topic they hadn't covered, a crucial piece of advice that couldn't wait. Soon, their meetings continued late into the night, framed as essential steps on her journey toward success. If you want to make it, he'd tell her, you have to be willing to put in the extra effort. And Monique, driven by ambition and eager to earn his approval, agreed without hesitation, convincing herself that these late-night sessions were necessary, vital steps toward the future she envisioned. She convinced herself that these late hours were part of her growth, a small price to pay for everything Clayton was offering. With each session, however, she found herself increasingly drawn to him, not merely as a mentor, but as someone she trusted deeply, someone she depended on in ways she couldn't fully understand. Clayton knew exactly what he was doing. Every word, every gesture was carefully crafted to make her believe their time together was both a privilege and a secret, something precious that had to be shielded from anyone who might misunderstand. Some people won't see this for what it really is, he'd say, his voice edged with a conspiratorial tone. They'll think it's inappropriate. They'll try to drive a wedge between us, tell you to quit, make you abandon your dream. But I know what you're capable of, Monique. Don't let anyone steal that from you. Monique believed him completely. Why wouldn't she? He was the sheriff, her father's trusted friend, the man who had known her since she was a child. If he said these meetings were essential, they were. If he insisted on secrecy for her own sake, she accepted it without question. She told no one, not her father, not Ella, not even her closest friends, about the time she spent with Clayton. Their late-night sessions became a world of their own, a place where Monique felt both vulnerable and powerful. Clayton made her feel like she was becoming someone important, someone capable of great things, and the more time they spent together, the more she relied on him, not just for guidance, but for emotional support. To her, he was a protector, someone who understood her in ways no one else did. But Clayton's mentorship wasn't solely about her future, it was about something self-serving. He ensured she needed him, not just for her career aspirations, but for her self-worth. With each passing week, Monique found herself more captivated, more dependent on his approval. She wasn't simply learning from him, she was falling under his influence. Then, one evening, the dynamic shifted entirely. They were reviewing case files, discussing real-world scenarios of high-stakes decision-making, when Clayton's hand lingered a moment too long on her shoulder. Monique didn't pull away, she didn't know she should. It felt like a natural extension of the closeness they had built, a quiet affirmation of the bond they shared. Clayton, sensing her acceptance, took it as an invitation to go further. The first kiss came without warning, but it didn't feel forced, it felt inevitable, like a step they had been gravitating toward all along. Monique, swept up in the moment, didn't question it. She had grown accustomed to following Clayton's lead, trusting his guidance. If this was part of their connection, she welcomed it. That night, the line between mentor and lover dissolved completely. What followed was no longer mentorship but a fully realized affair, cloaked in the same secrecy Clayton had so skillfully cultivated. Their meetings continued, now charged with an intense mixture of passion and control that left Monique feeling both exhilarated and exposed. She was falling, unable to see the danger in the illusion of power and trust he'd woven so tightly around her. Monique was falling deeper, convinced that what they shared was real. Clayton wasn't just a mentor anymore, he was her guide, her protector, her everything. But Clayton's hold on Monique went beyond mere emotion, it was absolute. He had woven himself into every corner of her life, and with each passing day, she leaned on him more, trusted him more, and believed fiercely that what they had was worth safeguarding. As their affair intensified, the walls around her seemed to close in, locking her into a world she didn't realize was built on manipulation and deceit. There was no escape now, Clayton had her exactly where he wanted, completely under his control and hopelessly in love. Secrets have a way of changing people, of seeping into the small cracks of life and subtly shifting everything off kilter. At first, the changes are slight, almost imperceptible. But over time, the weight of hidden truths begins to reveal itself. For Monique, her affair with Clayton had become the center of her universe. Where she was once open, cheerful, and deeply connected to those closest to her, she now began to pull away. Bit by bit, the Monique everyone knew was retreating into the shadows. Calls from friends went unanswered, hangouts with Ella became rare, and conversations with her father, Jerome, grew shorter with each passing day. Once, she had shared everything with him, the small wins, the daily frustrations. Now, she offered little more than one-word responses and vague excuses. Jerome felt the distance growing, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly why. He had always shared a close bond with Monique, one that most fathers would envy. But now, every effort to reconnect seemed to hit a wall. She was always busy, always tired, always somewhere else mentally. At first, he tried to brush it off, telling himself it was just a phase, perhaps stress from school or the pressure of planning her future. But as the days wore on, it became harder to ignore. Something was off in her demeanor, a shift he couldn't quite place. The Monique he knew didn't keep secrets, yet now it felt as though she was carrying a weight, something heavy and unspoken. Jerome wasn't one to let things slide for long. One evening, he saw his chance to confront her. Monique had come home late, her expression distant, as if her thoughts were far away. He waited until she was in the kitchen, setting her things down, then stepped in. "Monique," he said, keeping his tone steady, "we need to talk." Monique looked up, a flicker of guilt crossing her face before she masked it with a smile. "What's up, Dad?" she asked, her voice casual, though Jerome could hear the tension beneath it. "I've noticed you've been distant lately," Jerome said carefully. "You're not around as much. You're not talking to me like you used to. What's going on?" For a moment, Monique seemed taken aback, as if she hadn't expected him to notice. But then she forced another smile. "It's nothing, Dad. Just school, you know, a lot on my plate." Jerome wasn't convinced. No matter how hard she tried to act normal, he could feel the growing distance between them, and he sensed that something was deeply, troublingly wrong. As Jerome gently pressed her, asking if there was anything troubling her, anything she needed to share, Monique was ready. She had learned from Clayton how to dodge, how to deflect, how to steer conversations safely away from any dangerous ground without arousing too much suspicion. "I'm fine," she insisted, her voice a little too bright. "Really, Dad, you don't need to worry about me." Jerome wanted to believe her, wanted to take her words at face value, but a gnawing unease had settled in his gut, one he couldn't quite shake. Meanwhile, Clayton was carefully managing the shifting dynamics in his own life. His wife, Sharon, had started to sense that something was different. After years of marriage, she knew Clayton better than anyone, and recently, there were little things that didn't add up. He had always been a man of routine, steady, predictable, reliable. But now, there were moments when he seemed distant, distracted, as if his thoughts were somewhere far away. He came home later than usual, offering vague excuses about extra shifts or sudden meetings, and when he was home, there was a restlessness about him, an uncharacteristic unease that Sharon hadn't seen before. She asked him about it, of course, small, subtle questions, careful not to sound accusatory. "Is everything okay at work?" she'd ask during dinner, or, "You seem a little off lately. Is something bothering you?" Clayton was prepared for her questions. He knew how to lie just convincingly enough, how to weave in fragments of truth to keep her suspicions at bay. "It's just work," he'd say, his tone light but not too light. "You know how it gets this time of year." And while Sharon would let it go, for a while, at least, the nagging feeling didn't fade. She noticed the small details, how he checked his phone more often, how he seemed unusually guarded about his whereabouts. There were nights he came to bed long after she had fallen asleep, and mornings he left the house earlier than usual, always with an excuse ready. Sharon tried to convince herself she was overthinking it. Clayton was the sheriff, after all, and his job came with its share of stress. But deep down, she knew this wasn't just work. Something had shifted, she just couldn't pinpoint what. The tension in the Marshall household was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but it grew steadily, like a splinter buried beneath the skin, small enough to ignore, yet impossible to forget. Clayton was careful, though, careful to never let the cracks show too much, careful to keep the walls of his double life intact. He knew how to say the right things, how to offer just enough affection to keep suspicions at bay. To Sharon, he was still the man she'd married, just a little more worn, a bit more preoccupied. To his daughters, he was still their father, just a touch more distant than usual. But Clayton knew the truth. He knew the walls were closing in, slowly but inexorably, and no matter how carefully he managed things, the weight of his secret was beginning to take its toll. Monique, too, felt the strain. She missed the simplicity of her old life, missed the ease with which she could talk to her father, missed the carefree laughter she used to share with Ella. But every time she thought about stepping back, about pulling away from Clayton, she felt the invisible chains tighten. He had become more than just a mentor, more than just a lover, he was the center of her world. Even as she felt the widening chasm between herself and the people she loved, she told herself it was worth it. Clayton had promised her a future, had made her believe that what they shared was extraordinary. She couldn't turn back now, not when she had come this far. And so, the distance grew, between Monique and her father, between Clayton and his wife, between who they were and who they had become. The cracks were small but real, waiting, widening, threatening to shatter everything once the truth came to light. Secrets have a way of unraveling at the worst possible moment. What begins quietly, hidden in the shadows of stolen time, can grow into something that demands to be seen, no matter how carefully it's concealed. And for Clayton and Monique, the moment they had both feared, the moment they never believed would come, was finally upon them. Monique had sensed something was wrong for weeks. At first, she ignored it, convincing herself it was just stress, exhaustion. But as the days passed, the signs became harder to ignore, forcing her to face the truth creeping into her life. The signs became impossible to ignore, the morning nausea, the sudden exhaustion, the gnawing feeling that something had fundamentally changed within her. Eventually, Monique bought a pregnancy test, hoping, praying, that it was all in her head. But when 2 lines appeared, confirming her worst fears, the ground seemed to shift beneath her. She stared at the test, heart racing as 1,000 thoughts crashed through her mind. She wasn't ready for this, hadn't planned for this, and yet here it was, the undeniable proof that life, in all its chaotic unpredictability, had taken a turn she'd never anticipated. She sat in silence for what felt like hours, the weight of realization pressing heavily on her chest. And in that silence, only one thought surfaced clearly: she had to tell Clayton. He had promised to be there for her, to help her build a future. If anyone could help her through this, it would be him, wouldn't it? When Monique finally summoned the courage to tell him, it was during one of their late-night meetings. They sat together, the air between them thick with that familiar mix of tension and intimacy. She knew that once she spoke, everything would change, there would be no going back. "Clayton," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I need to tell you something." He glanced at her, sensing the gravity in her tone. "What is it?" he asked, leaning in slightly, bracing himself. Monique hesitated, her hands trembling, and then let the words spill out before she could reconsider. "I'm pregnant." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Clayton stared at her, his expression caught between disbelief and shock, as if her words were a bomb ticking in the air, each second stretching into eternity. Panic washed over him like a tidal wave, his mind racing through the implications, what this would mean for his career, his family, his reputation. Everything he built, everything he held together, now hung by a thread. If anyone found out, his wife, his daughters, the town, the department, his life would be over. Clayton felt the walls closing in, the weight of his double life crushing him from every direction. He needed a solution, something quick, something final. This couldn't get out. It wouldn't get out. "We can't do this," he said, his voice sharp, almost panicked. "This can't happen. No one can know." Monique looked at him, confusion and hurt flickering across her face. "What do you mean? We can figure this out. You said you'd always be there for me." Clayton ran a hand through his hair, his mind spinning, scrambling for a way out. He couldn't afford this scandal, he couldn't afford the fallout. And in his desperation, a single thought surfaced: there was still time to fix this, still time to make it go away. He leaned in, his voice low and urgent. You need to get rid of it, Monique. We have to end this before it's too late. Monique's heart sank at his words, disbelief crashing over her. She had come to him seeking support, reassurance. Instead, she was met with fear and rejection. You're asking me to have an abortion, she whispered, her voice cracking. Clayton nodded, desperation etched across his face. It's the only way, he insisted. If anyone finds out, my wife, your father, everything will be destroyed. We can't let that happen. Please, Monique, you have to do this. But Monique shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. No, she said firmly. I won't do that. This is our child, Clayton. You told me we were in this together. You promised. For the first time, Clayton saw how deeply she believed in the fantasy he had spun, that their relationship was real, that they had a future together. And in that instant, he grasped the full weight of his manipulation. She wasn't just carrying his child, she carried all the promises he had whispered, all the lies he had told to keep her close. His panic deepened. He tried to reason with her, to make her understand the danger they were in. You don't understand, he pleaded. If this gets out, my career is over, my family, my life, everything will be ruined. We can't let that happen, Monique. You have to do this. But Monique was resolute. She shook her head, her voice steady even as tears streamed down her face. I won't do it, she said, softly but firmly. I won't get rid of it. This is my child, and I refuse to feel ashamed for wanting to keep it. Clayton felt the ground slipping from beneath him, his control unraveling with every word she spoke. He had built his entire life on maintaining control, over his career, his family, his relationships, and now, faced with Monique's quiet defiance, that control was slipping through his fingers like sand. For the first time in his life, Clayton Marshall, the man everyone saw as steady, composed, in control, felt utterly powerless, and it terrified him. He tried one last time, his voice breaking under the weight of his desperation. Please, Monique, he whispered. If you care about me, if you care about what we have, you'll do this. You'll end it before it's too late. But Monique's resolve didn't waver. She looked him straight in the eye, her voice unwavering. No, she said simply. I'm keeping it. And in that moment, Clayton knew that the life he had so carefully built, the life he had fought so hard to protect, was on the brink of collapse. There was no going back now, the truth was out, and no matter how desperately Clayton tried to contain it, the consequences of his choices were closing in. The question wasn't if the truth would come to light, it was how much devastation it would leave in its wake. There comes a point where fear consumes everything, logic fades, morality crumbles, and all that remains is the instinct to survive, no matter the cost. For Clayton, that moment had arrived. With each passing day, the walls of his carefully curated life were closing in, and the truth loomed like a shadow, waiting to swallow him whole. Monique's pregnancy was a threat he couldn't outrun. No amount of lies or persuasion had worked. She had made her stance clear, and Clayton knew he was out of options. She had made her decision, she wasn't going to terminate the pregnancy. And with that, Clayton's world tilted on its axis. His career, his marriage, his reputation, everything now hung on a precarious edge. If the truth came out, there would be no redemption, no way to repair the wreckage it would leave in its wake. Restless nights found him staring at the ceiling, calculating every possible outcome, yet each scenario led to the same end, scandal, disgrace, and utter ruin. His name would be dragged through the mud, the sheriff's office would crumble under the weight of public outrage. Sharon would leave him, his daughters would cut all ties, and the town that once respected him would turn on him with fury. He saw no way out, no way to contain the damage. But then a thought crept in, a dark, chilling thought that should have horrified him, yet instead brought a twisted sense of clarity. There was one way, one final way to ensure the truth never surfaced. He told himself it was the only solution, the only way to preserve everything he had built. He knew it was wrong, knew that crossing this line would be a point of no return. But in his mind, it was no longer a choice between right and wrong, it was survival versus destruction. The plan took shape slowly, emerging from the dark corners of his mind. If Monique simply disappeared, no one would ever know. There would be questions, of course, but questions could be managed. He was the sheriff, after all, he had experience in controlling investigations, in steering them away from inconvenient truths. He could make it look as though she had vanished of her own accord, make certain no one would connect the dots. Clayton waited patiently until the time was right. He reached out to Monique, his voice calm and reassuring as he invited her to dinner at a secluded spot, just the two of them. He framed it as a chance to talk about the future, to make plans for the baby, to figure out how they could handle the situation together. And Monique, despite everything, still wanted to believe in him. She wanted to believe they could make things work, that Clayton would stand by her as he'd promised. She arrived at the location, a small, isolated cabin on the outskirts of town, far from prying eyes. Clayton greeted her with the same warm smile, the same comforting presence that had drawn her in from the beginning. He had prepared everything meticulously, a quiet dinner for just the two of them, wine poured into delicate glasses, a fire crackling in the hearth. They talked over dinner, their conversation laced with promises and reassurances. Clayton told her everything she wanted to hear, that they would figure it out, that they could still build a future together, that everything would be okay. And for a brief, fragile moment, Monique allowed herself to believe him. She let her guard down, feeling the familiar pull of the man she thought she knew. But Clayton's mind was elsewhere, focused on the small vial hidden in his pocket, a vial containing a drug that would ensure Monique never spoke a word. He waited for the perfect moment. Monique was immersed in the conversation, unaware of the tension simmering beneath his calm facade. When she looked down at her plate, he leaned in, his voice smooth and casual. "Let me top that off for you," he offered with an easy smile, lifting the wine bottle before she could respond. Lost in thoughts of a future with him and the baby, she barely noticed. With practiced ease, Clayton poured the wine, his other hand steady as he subtly palmed the vial. As the rich, red liquid flowed into her glass, he tilted the bottle just enough for the vial's contents to slip in, dissolving seamlessly. There was no stirring, no swirling, the drug vanished into the wine without a trace. He handed her the glass back, his voice light and conversational. "This should help us relax a bit," he said with a grin, watching as Monique, trusting and unsuspecting, took a sip, then another, the wine slipping down as the conversation continued. It didn't take long for the drug to take hold. Monique's eyelids grew heavy, her words began to slur as she tried to keep up with the conversation. Confusion clouded her face, and she looked at Clayton with a slight frown, as though trying to understand the sudden wave of exhaustion that had overtaken her. "I don't feel so good," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Clayton reached out, his hand resting on hers in a gesture of false comfort. "It's okay," he said softly. "You just need to rest. Everything's going to be fine." Monique's body grew limp, her head lolling to the side as the drug pulled her under. Clayton watched her for a moment, making sure the drug had done its work, then moved to the next phase of his plan without hesitation. He lifted her from the chair, her unconscious form cradled in his arms, a dark echo of the day he had once carried her as a child. But this time, there was no joy, no pride, only cold, relentless determination. Clayton drove in silence, the road stretching endlessly before him like a path to freedom. He had chosen the location meticulously, a secluded area deep within the woods, far from any trail or road. It was a place no one would stumble upon by chance, a place where secrets could remain hidden forever. The drive was long, each mile pressing down on him with the weight of what he was about to do, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The moment he crossed the line, there was no going back, only one path forward, and he was committed to seeing it through. When he reached the clearing, he stepped out of the truck, scanning his surroundings to ensure they were utterly alone. The forest was hushed, the trees standing like silent witnesses to what was about to unfold. Clayton opened the passenger door and lifted Monique from her seat, her body limp and unresponsive. He carried her deep into the woods, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. And there, in that forgotten place, he did what he had convinced himself was necessary. He knelt beside her, his hands trembling slightly as he placed them over her mouth and nose. Monique stirred briefly, her body instinctively reacting, but the drug had taken too strong a hold. Within moments, the struggle faded, and the forest was silent once more. Clayton sat there, his hands still pressed against her lifeless face, his breath coming in ragged gasps. And then, as if on autopilot, he began to dig. He worked quickly, dirt flying as he carved out a shallow grave. Time became a blur, the weight of his actions settling heavily in his chest, but he didn't stop, he couldn't afford to. When the grave was finished, he laid Monique's body inside, covering her with cold, damp earth. Just like that, she was gone, buried beneath a mountain of lies and betrayal. Clayton stood over the grave, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The night was still, the forest seeming to hold its breath, as if waiting to see what he would do next. But there was nothing left to do. He had made his choice, and now there was only silence. Without a word, Clayton turned and walked back to the truck, leaving no trace of what had occurred. The forest would keep his secret, and with it, the life he was so desperate to protect. But some secrets refused to stay buried. In a close-knit town, when someone goes missing, it sends shockwaves through every corner of the community. People rally together, neighbors exchange worried glances, and families hold each other closer, hoping it never happens to them. But this time, the missing person wasn't just anyone, it was Monique Ellis, the daughter of a beloved officer, a girl everyone knew and cherished. The day Monique didn't come home, panic began to spread. Her parents, Jerome and Denise Ellis, went from thinking she was merely running late to realizing something was terribly, terribly wrong. They called her phone, no answer. They reached out to her friends, but none of them had seen her. As the hours passed with no sign of Monique, a cold wave of dread crashed over them. Jerome felt it in his gut, a father's instinct he couldn't shake. Monique wasn't the kind of girl to disappear without a word, without letting someone know where she was. And as the sun set on that first day without her, Jerome did the only thing he could, he filed a missing persons report. The sheriff's office sprang into action, or so it appeared. Leading the search was none other than Clayton Marshall, the man with every reason to ensure Monique was never found. Clayton wore the mask of professionalism flawlessly, his voice steady, his demeanor calm, as he assured the community he would do everything in his power to bring Monique home. Yet every step he took was calculated, every lead pursued, every search organized, was orchestrated with one single aim, to keep the truth buried along with Monique. The search began immediately, with deputies canvassing the town and questioning anyone who might have seen her. Clayton made certain that every effort appeared genuine, with teams combing parks, abandoned buildings, and back roads. He was there at every turn, barking orders, comforting volunteers, and appearing to go above and beyond. To everyone else, he looked like a man relentless in his mission to find the missing girl. But in reality, Clayton stayed 2 steps ahead, steering the investigation away from the one place they'd never search, the remote spot where Monique's body lay hidden beneath the cold earth. Jerome, desperate for answers, leaned heavily on Clayton, his longtime friend and mentor. Clayton played his role expertly, offering words of comfort and support, his arms slung around Jerome's shoulders as they sifted through possibilities together. "We'll find her, Jerome," he said more than once, his voice unwavering. "I promise you, we'll bring her home." Each time Jerome's hope began to wane, Clayton was there to catch him. He remained close to the family, visiting their home frequently, sitting at their kitchen table, and holding Denise's hand as she wept. He became their lifeline amidst the chaos, the one person they felt they could truly depend on when everything else seemed to be unraveling. And that was exactly how Clayton wanted it. Clayton maintained an iron grip on the investigation, meticulously controlling the narrative, guiding deputies and volunteers toward false leads. He subtly suggested that perhaps Monique had left town on her own, maybe overwhelmed by the pressures of school and life. He floated ideas that she might be staying with an unknown friend or even that someone she knew had offered her a ride. His theories planted seeds of doubt, redirecting the search down meaningless paths that led nowhere. Clayton knew precisely how to manipulate the emotions of those around him, expertly playing the role of the concerned sheriff while subtly nudging the investigation further from the truth. Whenever search teams got close to an area he feared they might uncover, Clayton conveniently discovered a new lead, a supposed sighting on the other side of town, a tip that demanded immediate attention elsewhere. He kept everyone moving, always one step behind where they needed to be, ensuring no one ever ventured near the grave where Monique's body rested. Meanwhile, Monique's parents clung to every word Clayton said, believing he was doing everything possible to find their daughter. Jerome, especially, relied on Clayton more than anyone. As a father and an officer, Jerome felt helpless in the face of his daughter's disappearance. But with Clayton at the helm, he held on to a glimmer of hope, convinced that if anyone could bring Monique back, it was the man he trusted for so many years. Clayton knew precisely how to exploit that trust, using it to keep Jerome close while keeping the truth hidden. He included Jerome in every step of the investigation, giving him just enough responsibility to feel involved but never enough to reveal the truth. And when Jerome's frustration reached a boiling point, Clayton was there to absorb it, allowing him to vent his grief without raising any suspicion. "I should have been there," Jerome said more than once, guilt and anguish thick in his voice. "I should have protected her." Clayton would shake his head, his expression solemn. "This isn't your fault, Jerome. We'll find her. I promise we'll find her." It was the perfect manipulation, a delicate balance of comfort and control, of empathy and deceit. Clayton gave the Elisas just enough hope to keep them from digging too deeply, just enough reassurance to stop them from noticing the holes in the investigation. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no trace of Monique. The community grew restless, rumors spreading like wildfire, theories whispered in hushed tones. Some speculated she had run away, others feared something far worse. But through it all, Clayton remained a steady presence, the man who appeared to be tirelessly devoted to finding Monique, even as he led everyone farther from the truth. Everyone looked to him for answers, but behind the scenes, the weight of Clayton's actions was beginning to take its toll. Each day the investigation dragged on was a relentless reminder of the terrible truth he was hiding. Though he wore the mask of a concerned sheriff well, there were fleeting moments when the cracks began to show, moments when guilt gnawed at the edges of his mind, threatening to unravel the carefully constructed lie he had built. But Clayton couldn't afford to falter. The moment he slipped, the moment he let his guard down, everything would come crashing down around him. So he kept moving, kept directing the search, kept feeding Jerome and Denise just enough hope to keep them holding on. He knew that time was on his side. The longer the search went on without results, the more people would begin to believe Monique was gone for good. And if the investigation continued to stall, eventually it would fade into the background, a tragedy left unsolved, a mystery with no answers. That was the hope Clayton clung to, that the search would fizzle out, that the town would move on, and that his secret would remain buried where no one would ever find it. But secrets have a way of rising to the surface, no matter how deeply they're buried. And as the days passed, the pressure on Clayton grew heavier, the cracks in his carefully controlled world widening with each passing moment. The investigation he had worked so hard to control was slipping further from his grasp, and the harder he tried to contain it, the more fragile it became. Yet for now, Clayton remained in control, just barely. He kept the investigation alive just enough to maintain appearances, kept Jerome close enough to keep him from looking elsewhere, and kept the truth buried beneath layers of lies and misdirection. But Clayton knew, deep down, that this fragile charade couldn't last forever. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered, and when it finally came to light, it would tear through everything in its path. Time has a way of dulling memories and softening the sharp edges of grief, but not for everyone. 5 months after Monique's disappearance, the town had begun to settle back into routine, as communities do after a tragedy. Life moved on, though her absence lingered in quiet moments, and her name remained on the lips of those who still held out hope for answers. Yet as the days stretched into months, even hope began to dim. It was becoming another cold case, one of those tragic mysteries that leave more questions than answers. The search parties had dwindled, the posters plastered on storefronts had started to peel, and the once constant buzz of speculation had faded to murmurs. It seemed, at least to some, that Monique had simply vanished without a trace. Clayton Marshall believed that, with time, the truth would stay buried, just like Monique. But then, as it often does in stories like these, the truth began to surface from the most unexpected place. Secrets rarely stay buried forever, no matter how deeply someone tries to hide them. It wasn't detectives or investigators who uncovered the first crack in Clayton Marshall's web of lies, it was two ordinary hikers out for what should have been a peaceful day on the trails. They had no idea that what lay ahead would unravel a mystery that had haunted the town for months. The hikers, a couple in their late 20s, had ventured deep into a forested area rarely visited by anyone other than wildlife enthusiasts. The trail was rough and winding, twisting through dense woods where silence reigned, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. It was the kind of place where one wouldn't expect to find anything but nature, certainly not a hidden secret. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows along the path, they noticed something odd. An unnatural disturbance in the ground just off the trail, a patch of earth that appeared uneven and slightly sunken compared to the forest floor around it. The hikers exchanged uneasy glances. It could have been anything, a buried animal, perhaps, but something about it felt unsettlingly out of place. Their curiosity got the better of them, and with hesitant steps, they approached the disturbed ground. One of them knelt down to inspect it more closely and noticed something chilling. A small piece of fabric, barely visible beneath the dirt and fallen leaves. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send a shiver down their spines. They knew better than to disturb the site any further. Instead, they marked the location with their GPS and hurried back to the nearest ranger station, their hearts pounding with a mix of fear and disbelief. The rangers, alerted by the hikers' discovery, contacted local authorities, and within hours, a full investigative team was on site. What they found beneath the disturbed ground confirmed the hikers' worst fears. Monique Ellis's body, carefully wrapped in a tarp, lay in a shallow grave. Her remains told a silent, heartbreaking story of betrayal and violence. But the discovery didn't just reveal her final resting place, it raised even more questions. How had Monique ended up here, and more importantly, who had put her there? As the forensic team worked meticulously at the scene, law enforcement officers scoured the surrounding area for clues. And it was there, among the dirt and foliage, that they found the first undeniable piece of evidence, a small vial, half buried in the earth, bearing the faint imprint of a fingerprint. At first glance, it seemed insignificant, but it would later prove vital to the investigation. With Monique's body recovered, the case had shifted in a way Clayton had hoped would never happen. The carefully buried truth had begun to resurface, and the ripple it created would soon turn into a wave that threatened to wash away every lie he had told. The case that had gone cold was suddenly reignited. Detectives took over the investigation, determined to uncover the truth behind Monique's disappearance. They meticulously combed through GPS data from Monique's phone, retracing her movements from the night she vanished, and what they found began to unravel the carefully woven lies Clayton had spun. The data revealed a troubling pattern. Monique's phone had pinged from several locations far from where Clayton had claimed she was last seen. Among them was a remote gas station just outside of town, an otherwise unremarkable stop that would soon become a crucial piece of evidence. When detectives secured surveillance footage from the gas station, the full scope of Clayton's deception came into sharp focus. The grainy footage, recorded on the night Monique disappeared, showed Clayton's truck pulling into the parking lot. His expression was tense, his eyes scanning the area as if checking for any unwelcome attention. In the passenger seat sat Monique, slumped and unmoving, her head resting against the window, her body limp. Clayton exited the vehicle, glanced around the lot, and went inside briefly, emerging moments later to cast another quick look toward Monique's lifeless form before sliding back into the driver's seat. With a final glance over his shoulder, he drove off into the night, the truck disappearing from the camera's view, and, until now, from the town's collective memory. The video was damning, not only because it placed Clayton with Monique on the night she disappeared, but because of her vulnerable state in his company, unconscious and defenseless with the very man who had sworn to protect her. The footage raised urgent questions. Why had Clayton never mentioned being with Monique that night? Why had he omitted this encounter from his official statements? And, most disturbingly, what had happened after they left the gas station? With Monique's movements traced to the burial site and surveillance footage tying Clayton to her final hours, detectives knew they were closing in on the truth. But they needed more than suspicion, they needed irrefutable evidence. The key lay in the digital breadcrumbs Monique's phone had left behind. GPS data from Clayton's truck, pulled from onboard tracking systems, provided the final piece of the puzzle. The logs confirmed what the surveillance footage had suggested. Clayton's truck had traveled directly from the gas station to the remote area where Monique's body was found, matching the exact location marked by the hikers. Every turn, every stop was accounted for, painting a chilling picture of premeditation and cover-up. It was a trail Clayton hadn't expected anyone to follow, but no matter how carefully he had tried to conceal his actions, the truth had found its way to the surface, first through the hikers on the trail, and then through the relentless work of investigators determined to expose the lies lurking beneath. The discovery of Monique's body wasn't just the end of a search, it was the beginning of justice. The hikers, unaware of the storm their quiet walk in the woods would set off, had unwittingly unearthed the secret Clayton Marshall had buried, both literally and figuratively. As the investigation gained momentum, the truth about Clayton's betrayal spread through the town like wildfire. His carefully crafted facade of authority crumbled beneath the weight of the mounting evidence, and with each new discovery, the community began to understand the depth of his deception and the price Monique had paid for his abuse of power. The hikers' discovery on that remote trail became the turning point in a case that had remained cold for far too long. And as the town braced for the storm to come, one thing was certain, no secret, no matter how deeply buried, could stay hidden forever. The click of handcuffs echoed through the quiet office as they locked around Clayton's wrists, the cold metal biting into his skin. He said nothing, the fight drained from him as the weight of his actions settled like a stone in his chest. There was no more running, no more lying. The truth had caught up with him, and there was nowhere left to hide. The agents guided him out of the office, past the deputies who had once respected him, past the desks where he had once commanded authority. Now, they looked at him not as their sheriff, but as the man who had betrayed everything the badge stood for. Whispers followed him down the hall, the weight of their judgment pressing heavily on his shoulders. As the agents escorted Clayton to the waiting car, the sun rose high in the sky, casting its unforgiving light on the man who had hidden in the shadows for far too long. The harsh light fell upon Clayton Marshall on this day of reckoning. The truth, once buried beneath layers of lies and manipulation, had finally surfaced, and with it, Clayton Marshall's life as he knew it was irrevocably destroyed. The man who had once embodied justice was now bound by the same system he once commanded, a prisoner of his own sins. As the car doors slammed shut, the message was unmistakable: no one, not even the sheriff, is above the law. Grief is unbearable in itself, but to learn the full extent of a tragedy brings a pain that few can imagine. When detectives recovered Monique Ellis's body, the nightmare intensified with each new revelation. It wasn't just the betrayal of trust, the horrific murder, or the loss of a young life. The autopsy uncovered one final, devastating truth that shattered what little remained of her family's world: Monique had been in the early stages of pregnancy. The child she had been carrying, Clayton Marshall's child, was growing inside her when her life was violently taken. This discovery transformed her parents' grief into something immeasurable. They weren't just mourning their daughter, they were grieving for a grandchild they would never meet. It was a loss layered with betrayal, violation, and shattered dreams. Jerome Ellis could barely process the news, his hands trembling as detectives informed him of the pregnancy. It was more than he could bear, the knowledge that his own daughter had carried a child, only to be silenced by a man he trusted, a man who had sat at his kitchen table, offering comfort as they searched for her. The weight of that betrayal pressed down on Jerome's chest, suffocating him with guilt he couldn't shake. How had he missed the signs? How could he have stood beside Clayton, searching for his daughter, while the man responsible was there, leading them astray? And the pregnancy, he hadn't even known she was in a relationship, let alone involved with someone like Clayton. The betrayal struck him in layers, peeling back everything he thought he knew and leaving him raw and exposed. Denise Ellis, already buried under the weight of grief, fell into complete despair upon hearing the autopsy results. That child would have been her first grandchild, a new beginning, a reason to hope. Now, both Monique and the unborn child were gone, buried together under a shroud of lies and deception. No words could ease the agony of such a loss. Every dream Denise had for her daughter's future was gone, cruelly wiped away. News of Monique's pregnancy spread quickly, turning an already horrific crime into something even more unimaginable. Clayton Marshall wasn't just a murderer, he was a predator who had exploited his position of power, manipulated a young girl, and taken 2 lives to cover his tracks. The man once seen as the community's protector was now viewed as a symbol of everything they despised. Protesters gathered outside the sheriff's office and courthouse, their voices echoing through the streets, signs demanding justice for Monique and baby. Calls for Clayton's conviction grew louder by the day. The community, once proud of their sheriff, now viewed him as a monster in uniform. Every kind gesture, every award he had received, now felt like a mockery of the evil he had hidden beneath his badge. In the Marshall household, the revelations were equally devastating. Sharon Marshall sat in stunned silence as the news unfolded, her world collapsing under the weight of her husband's lies. She had been blindsided by the affair, shattered by the murder, but the pregnancy was the final blow, the one truth she could hardly comprehend. Her mind wandered back to every moment she had shared with Clayton, every day he had spent with their daughters, knowing now that he had carried this unspeakable secret all along. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the knowledge that her husband had fathered a child with Monique, a girl they had watched grow up, a friend to their own daughter. The sheer cruelty of it left her speechless. Ella Marshall, Clayton's youngest daughter and Monique's best friend, was crushed by the news. She had spent weeks mourning Monique, struggling to make sense of how her father could be involved in such a crime. Now, learning the full truth, the murder, the affair, and the pregnancy, shattered her heart completely, leaving her feeling betrayed, devastated, and irrevocably changed. Learning about the pregnancy was too much for Ella to bear. Monique had been carrying her half-sibling, and now both were gone, taken by the man she once called Dad. The betrayal was so profound that Ella didn't know how to process it. She withdrew into herself, shutting out the world, refusing to speak to her father, not even acknowledging his existence. The very thought of him filled her with disgust. Every memory they had shared, every moment she once cherished, was now tainted by the knowledge of what he had done. It felt as if her entire life had been built on lies, and the weight of that realization crushed her. Harper, Clayton's older daughter, responded with fierce anger. She had always been close to her father, had looked up to him as a role model, only to discover that he had committed unspeakable acts against someone she had grown up with. The pregnancy was the final straw. Harper packed her things and left the house, severing all ties with her father, unable to forgive him for the lives he had shattered. The Marshall home, once filled with laughter and routine, became a silent war zone. Sharon tried desperately to hold her daughters together, but there was no mending the damage Clayton had done. Their family was broken beyond repair, fractured by the enormity of his betrayal. And in the quiet moments, when the world felt still, Sharon sat alone, grappling with the reality that the man she had loved for decades was capable of such monstrous acts. The community's anger burned hotter with every passing day. Monique had been one of their own, bright, ambitious, full of promise. Now, she and her unborn child were gone, victims of a man they had once trusted. The demand for justice was unrelenting. They wanted to see Clayton punished, not only for Monique's death but for the life of the child she carried. They wanted to ensure that he would never have the chance to hurt anyone again. Jerome and Denise found some solace in the community's support, but it was cold comfort. The loss of their daughter and grandchild left a void that could never be filled. They attended every court hearing, sitting in the front row, determined to see Clayton face the full weight of justice. Yet they knew that even a conviction wouldn't bring Monique back, and seeing Clayton in handcuffs wouldn't heal the wounds left behind. The tragedy that began with Clayton's manipulation had grown into something far larger, a story of betrayal, loss, and broken trust. The community would never forget what had happened, and neither would the families involved. Clayton Marshall's name would forever be associated with pain, with loss, and with the lives he had destroyed to protect his own secrets. And as the trial loomed, the town prepared for the final chapter, a reckoning long overdue, for Monique, her child, and everyone whose lives had been shattered by the man they once called sheriff. The trial of Clayton Marshall gripped both the community and the nation, drawing everyone into the dark tale of betrayal, manipulation, and murder. Reporters crowded the courtroom, cameras stationed outside like vultures ready to capture every moment of the sheriff's downfall. This was not just a trial, it was a reckoning, one that demanded every ugly truth be laid bare for the world to see. From the start, the prosecution wasted no time in presenting their case, weaving a narrative of manipulation that exposed Clayton's true nature, a man who had exploited his authority and preyed upon someone who trusted him implicitly. Every action he took, they argued, was calculated, from the beginning of the affair to the cold-blooded murder that followed. Clayton Marshall, they said, was not the man the community had thought he was. He was a man who used his badge as a shield, hiding his darkest impulses behind a mask of respectability. Piece by piece, the prosecution reconstructed the events leading up to Monique's death, using surveillance footage, phone records, and forensic evidence to paint a damning picture. They exposed Clayton's manipulative tactics, showing how he convinced Monique to meet him under the pretense of mentorship. They explained how he lured her to the remote location, drugged her, and ultimately took her life to protect his own reputation and career. The courtroom was silent as the prosecutors detailed Clayton's actions, every word felt like a hammer striking the very foundation of trust. Each piece of evidence served as a reminder of the man Clayton pretended to be, and the monster he had become. Then came the emotional testimonies, and with them, the heart of the trial was laid bare. Monique's parents, Jerome and Denise Ellis, were the first to take the stand. There was no masking the grief etched into their faces, nor the weight of the pain they carried as they spoke about the daughter they had lost. Jerome's voice cracked as he recalled the first day Clayton had joined their search for Monique, standing beside him as a trusted friend. "He looked me in the eye," Jerome said, struggling to hold back tears. "He told me we'd find her, and the whole time, he knew exactly where she was." His voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands, the weight of the betrayal too much to bear. Denise's testimony was equally heart-wrenching. She spoke about Monique's dreams, the plans they had discussed late at night over cups of tea. She wanted to make a difference, Denise whispered, her voice trembling. She wanted to work for the detectives, to protect people. And instead, the man we trusted, our friend, stole her future and buried it in the ground. Her words hung in the air, filled with the sorrow of a mother who would never see her daughter grow into the woman she was meant to become. As the trial continued, the courtroom was thick with tension. Every testimony, every exhibit brought the grim truth into sharper focus. But the most shocking testimony came from Clayton's own family. Sharon Marshall, his wife, took the stand with a heavy heart, her voice steady but filled with disbelief. "I don't know who my husband is anymore," she admitted. "The man I married, the father of my children, wasn't capable of this, or at least I thought he wasn't." She spoke of the months of lies, the late nights when Clayton came home with excuses that now felt like cruel deceptions. "I believed him," she said quietly. "I believed every word. And now I have to live with the fact that I was married to a man I never truly knew." Her words landed with the weight of 1,000 betrayals, a wife forced to confront the darkest truth about the man she had loved. Ella Marshall, Clayton's youngest daughter and Monique's best friend, gave perhaps the most painful testimony of the trial. As she sat in the witness chair, tears streaming down her face, she spoke about the friendship she had shared with Monique and the devastation she felt when the full truth came to light. "She was my best friend." "Friend," Ella said, her voice trembling. She was like a sister to me. And my father, my own father, took her away from me. The room fell into a profound silence as Ella's grief spilled out, raw and unfiltered. The prosecution pressed on, painting a damning picture of a man who had not only betrayed his badge but destroyed 2 families in the process. They detailed the lengths Clayton had gone to maintain control, his manipulation of Monique, the lies he told his family, and the intricate web of deceit he spun around everyone who trusted him. Finally, it was Clayton's turn to face questioning. The room was still as he took the stand, the weight of his actions pressing down on him from every side. At first, he denied the affair, denied everything, clinging to the hope he could somehow escape the consequences. But as the evidence mounted, it became clear there was no escape. Under relentless questioning, his defenses began to crumble. His mask of calm authority slipped away, revealing a man consumed by fear, regret, and guilt. At first, his answers were clipped and guarded as he tried to hold on to control, but the prosecutor's questions cut deeper, forcing him to confront the reality of his actions. "Did you have an affair with Monique?" the prosecutor asked, his voice steady and unyielding. Clayton hesitated, the weight of the truth suffocating him. He opened his mouth to deny it again, but the words wouldn't come. His shoulders sagged under the crushing burden, and for the first time, he told the truth. "Yes," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I did." The confession sent a ripple through the courtroom. Clayton's family sat frozen in disbelief, while Monique's parents clutched each other, overwhelmed by grief. But the prosecutor wasn't finished. He pressed further, forcing Clayton to confront the full extent of his actions. "And did you kill her?" he asked, leaning in closer. "Did you take her life to protect your secret?" Clayton's composure shattered. His hands trembled as he buried his face in them, the weight of his guilt too heavy to bear. "Yes," he choked out. "I killed her. I didn't know what else to do." His sobs filled the courtroom, the sound of a man broken by his own sins. The room sat in stunned silence, his confession hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. There were no more lies to tell, no more masks to wear. Clayton Marshall, once the respected sheriff, had admitted to the unthinkable. The trial was far from over, but the truth had finally come to light. Clayton's confession marked the beginning of the end, an end that would bring justice for Monique and her unborn child, and some semblance of closure to the families whose lives had been shattered. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the day's proceedings, one thing was certain: Clayton Marshall's fate was sealed, and there would be no escaping the consequences of his actions. The courtroom was silent, heavy with the weight of justice about to be delivered. Clayton Marshall stood shackled before the judge, his shoulders slumped under the crushing weight of what he had done. But no chains, no bars, could ever truly reflect the gravity of the lives lost at his hands, the life of Monique Ellis, the young woman he betrayed, and the unborn child she carried. This was not just the sentencing of a man, it was the reckoning for 2 lives stolen too soon. The judge cleared his throat, his face solemn as he addressed the courtroom. His words carried the sorrow of the community, the devastation of 2 grieving families, and the shame of betrayal by a man once entrusted with power and responsibility. There would be no easy way to deliver this sentence, for no words could fully capture the harm inflicted by Clayton Marshall. "Mr. Marshall," the judge began, his voice calm but firm, "you have not only committed a grievous crime, but you have also inflicted irreparable damage upon the lives of those you were sworn to protect. You betrayed a young woman who trusted you, exploited her vulnerability under the guise of mentorship, and in doing so, took advantage of your authority in the most despicable way imaginable." The courtroom remained still as the judge's gaze hardened. Monique Ellis was not only a victim of your manipulation, she was a young woman with dreams, ambitions, and a future ahead of her, a future that included the unborn child she carried, a child you helped create, and a child you silenced when you decided to take Monique's life. Gasps rippled through the gallery, the weight of the revelation setting in once again. Monique had carried within her not just the hopes of her parents but the beginnings of a new life, a life that would never see the light of day, all because of Clayton's desperate need to cover his tracks. The judge paused, allowing the gravity of his words to sink in before continuing. The child growing inside Monique was your child, Mr. Marshall. You knew that revelation would ruin your career, your reputation, and your family. And in a moment of selfishness and cowardice, you chose to end 2 lives to protect yourself. That choice reflects the depth of your betrayal, not only to Monique but to your own unborn child. Tears streamed down the faces of Jerome and Denise Ellis as the judge acknowledged their unimaginable loss. They were not only mourning their daughter but also the grandchild they would never meet. The double loss weighed heavily on them, and the judge's words only confirmed the depth of Clayton's treachery. Sharon Marshall clutched her hands tightly in her lap, as if the sheer force of her grip could keep her from shattering completely. Clayton's daughters, Ella and Harper, sat motionless, numb from the revelations that had torn their family apart. Monique's unborn child would have been their half-sibling, a truth too painful for them to fully comprehend. The judge's voice remained steady, though his expression was one of deep disappointment. The badge you wore, Mr. Marshall, was meant to serve as a symbol of integrity, responsibility, and protection. But you wielded it as a shield to hide your darkest intentions. You manipulated, betrayed, and destroyed. This court cannot undo the harm you've caused, nor can it restore the lives you took. But it can ensure that you never again harm another soul. The room held its breath as the judge delivered the sentence. This court finds you guilty of first-degree murder, abuse of authority, and gross misconduct. In light of the severity of these crimes, and the fact that your actions resulted in the deaths of both Monique Ellis and your unborn child, I hereby sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel struck with a sharp crack, the sound reverberating through the courtroom like a final judgment. There would be no reprieve, no chance for redemption. Clayton Marshall's fate was sealed, and he would spend the remainder of his days paying for the lives he had destroyed, for the rest of his days in a prison cell, haunted by the lives he had taken. The gallery sat in silence as the weight of the sentence settled in. Jerome and Denise clung to each other, their grief too overwhelming for words. The innocent life Monique had carried, a child caught in the crossfire of manipulation and betrayal, would never be known, never have a name. That loss, like a wound that could never heal, would stay with them forever. On the other side of the courtroom, Sharon lowered her head, unable to reconcile the man she had married with the monster now led away in chains. Her daughters, Ella and Harper, sat frozen, their emotions swirling in a storm of confusion and sorrow. The trial had exposed too much, truths they never wanted to know, burdens they never thought they'd bear. As Clayton was escorted from the courtroom, the community watched in stunned silence. They had placed their trust in him, and he had shattered it in the worst way imaginable. The sentence was justice, but it could never truly heal the scar he left behind. Monique and her child were gone, and no amount of justice could bring them back. The judge's final words lingered as the courtroom emptied. Let this serve as a reminder, he had said, that power is not a privilege but a responsibility. When that responsibility is betrayed, there are consequences. No one is above the law, and no betrayal will go unanswered. The trial of Clayton Marshall would be remembered not only as the story of one man's fall from grace but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of accountability. It was a reminder that authority means nothing without integrity and that every betrayal, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually rise to the surface. With Clayton sentenced to life without parole, the community was left to pick up the pieces. Justice had been served, but the loss remained, a haunting reminder of lives stolen too soon and trust that could never be restored. Even after the trial ended and Clayton Marshall was locked away, the pain he had caused lingered like a shadow over the community. There were no easy answers, no quick resolutions. Monique's death was not just a tragedy, it was a reckoning that forced everyone to confront the reality of betrayal masked by power and trust. In the wake of such devastation, healing was slow and uneven, but it had to begin somewhere. For Jerome and Denise Ellis, the loss of their daughter was a wound that would never fully heal. There were days when the grief felt unbearable, when the silence left behind by Monique's absence was deafening. Yet they refused to let her memory be defined solely by tragedy. Determined to create something meaningful from their pain, they founded the Monique Ellis Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting young women who had suffered abuse at the hands of those in power. The foundation became a beacon of hope, providing legal aid, counseling, and mentorship for survivors. What started as a local initiative quickly grew, attracting national attention. The Ellis family traveled the country, speaking at schools and community centers, determined to prevent other families from facing the nightmare they had endured. For Jerome and Denise, the foundation was a way to honor their daughter's memory and protect others from the dangers she had faced. But healing took many forms, and not all of it was visible to the public. Sharon Marshall and her daughters, Ella and Harper, quietly packed their lives into boxes and left town, hoping to escape the scandal that had engulfed their family. The weight of Clayton's betrayal was too great to bear in the community they once called home. Every street, every face, was a painful reminder of what had been lost. Sharon chose a town far from the headlines, a place where she and her daughters could start fresh. For Ella and Harper, moving away offered a chance at healing, though it also meant confronting the reality of who their father truly was. It would be years before they could fully process what had happened, before they could separate their memories of the man they loved from the monster he became. Their journey toward healing would be long and complicated, but it was a step they were ready to take together. Back in town, the community struggled to rebuild trust. Trust, once freely given, had become a guarded treasure. The sheriff's office underwent a complete overhaul, with new leadership committed to restoring public faith. Policies were rewritten, safeguards were established, and mandatory ethics and accountability training became standard. The town knew it would take more than new policies to restore trust, but they were willing to try. Local schools and community groups partnered with the Ellis Foundation to create programs that educated young people about the dangers of manipulation and abuse of power. It became part of the town's identity, a lesson learned the hard way but one they were determined never to forget. Monique's story was shared openly, not as a scar but as a powerful reminder of the importance of speaking up, of holding those in power accountable. There were still moments of anger and frustration. The wound Clayton left behind would take years to heal, and some might never fully recover. But, slowly, bit by bit, the community found ways to move forward. They knew that healing wasn't about forgetting, it was about remembering, learning, and becoming stronger and wiser through the pain. Even as the town began to rebuild, a question lingered, haunting every family, every officer, and everyone who had followed the case: how do we protect ourselves from those sworn to protect us? Clayton Marshall had worn a badge, taken an oath to serve and protect, yet he had used that badge to manipulate, betray, and destroy. His story wasn't just one of personal failure, it was a warning, a reminder that power in the wrong hands is a dangerous thing. The question now wasn't just about justice for Monique but about preventing the next betrayal before it happened. This story isn't the only one of its kind. There are others, other abuses of power, other betrayals hidden behind authority, waiting to be uncovered. Stories of manipulation, exploitation, and control that demand to be told. Stories that remind us why accountability matters and why we must never stop questioning those who hold power. And so we leave you with this question: what would you do if the person meant to protect you became the one you feared most? How do we guard against those who hide behind trust and authority? There are more stories to tell, more truths waiting to be revealed. Join us for the next chapter as we uncover another shocking case of abuse of power, one that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Please subscribe and stay with us as we continue to expose the stories that demand justice and accountability. Because the only way to prevent betrayal is to shine a light on the dark corners where it hides. This isn't the end, it's only the beginning.